What's up, YouTube, and welcome back to another Talkin TV Top 10 list. So last year, at the height of the pandemic, when there were no new things coming out, a lot of people were looking backwards at the movies of yesteryear, particularly at the last decade of film, given that a lot of movies that still felt pretty recent were coming up on a decade of existence. Given that trend allowed me to head backwards and catch up on a lot of the movies that I'd missed from the last couple decades, I've decided to continue that trend into this year. At the beginning of the year, myself and Chris broke down our top 10 favorite movies that turned 20 in 2021. And so for this list, I'm going a little bit more recent with my favorite movies from 2011. 2011 was an interesting year because it's the one year from the 2010s that doesn't really have a distinct identity of its own, and yet was an extremely crucial year as far as the identity of the overall decade goes. This is the year that saw the start of several gigantic action franchises that would go on to dominate the box office for the next 10 years, as well as the rise of the independent film movement that eventually contributed to the rise of studios like A24 and Neon. It was experimental, dared to break down a lot of conventions, and was an important year nevertheless. And so, without further ado, here are my top 10 favorite movies turning 10 in 2021. Contagion. This movie gained a second life because of the pandemic. Steven Soderbergh has always been a director known for going the non-traditional route with the stories that he tells, but in this case, it's that exact case of not wanting to tell stories in a traditional Hollywood way that led to this film being so scarily accurate to what we went through last year that it almost felt like a documentary being shot in real time, rather than a film that was barely hitting a decade of existence. This film takes a look at a group of different people in various different levels of society as the world is rocked by a global pandemic virus that starts wiping out people by the thousands, and it examines the effect it has on every level, from the bureaucrats urging everyone to act rationally, to the medical workers struggling to help as many people as they can and find out what caused this, to the media looking to capitalize on this horror for profit, to the everyday people who are just trying to get by. Soderbergh and writer Scott Z. Burns were inspired by the initial SARS outbreak in 2002 and the swine flu pandemic in 2009, and their ability to seamlessly mix big-name actors with a story that is such the antithesis of the typical star vehicle is so brutally honest with its portrayal of society at large during a crisis, literally to the point where it almost feels like you're watching a vision of what was to come. The film shot to Netflix's #1 most watched thing at the beginning of the pandemic, and given how our society reacted in real time to the COVID-19 virus, it's understandable why. It's a movie that people took for granted at the time of its release, but grew in popularity over the years because of how ahead of its time it was, and it still, on its own, manages to stand as an incredible movie. Fast 5. One of the top 5 greatest movies ever made, and I don't mean that as a joke. Look, we all know the reputation that the Fast and Furious franchise has garnered in recent years, but there was a time when that franchise's existence was in danger. After the introduction of Justin Lin with Tokyo Drift in 2006, and the return of both Paul Walker and Vin Diesel in 2009's Fast and Furious, Fast 5 came in to deliver this franchise to the heights that it struggled to attain for so long, and it did just that and more. While the franchise certainly has its fans and detractors, one cannot deny that absolutely cavalier nature it has towards its characters and stunts, still managing to inject fresh amounts of heart, humor, and humanity into a franchise largely focused around ridiculous car stunts and superhero-level feats. But the reason why this entry stands above the rest is because it ultimately does capture all the best elements to bring together something that's a mix between Ocean's 11 and James Bond. It was the first time that it felt like someone understood the franchise. I know it's hard to remember given that these movies have evolved so far into self-parody territory, but there was a time when these actually had a chance to be solid action movies smashed together with other genres, with actual genuine characters that we had gotten to know and care for over the years. It was the only time in the franchise that they got every single element right, which is what gives it a spot on this list. Attack the Block. So I'm a big fan of the show Skins. I love any story that involves London teenagers, really. Just something about the way they're able to mix their always prim and proper sounding accents with the most questionable of extracurricular activities always has been a source of awe. But you mix that feel with a low budget sci-fi horror that's reminiscent of the best 80s movies, instant cult classic material. The film follows a group of South London youths and a young woman played by the 12th Doctor who discover an alien invasion happening right in their block and attempt to fight it off and survive the night. This movie was the directorial debut of Joe Cornish, as well as the feature debuts for actor John Boyega and composer Stephen Price, and every part of this movie just works. The camera work and editing are fluid and keep things moving at a progressive pace. The practical effects on the aliens are incredibly well done, and the way that they're shot allows for them to avoid showing off the low budget. And the film does an excellent job of blending the comedy with the horror, evoking the best of Joe Dante and John Carpenter. While J.J. Abrams' Super 8 definitely wore its Spielberg influences more so on its sleeves, this film I feel carried that spirit of the 80s just so much better, with such a genuine sense of self rather than just dressing up previous types in a new coat of paint. Rise of the Planet of the Apes. It still annoys me that this reboot franchise is as underrated as it is, and it all started here. 2011 is the year that kicked off 90% of the franchises that drove the 2010s, but there's a strong argument to be made that quality-wise, this is one of the best. Despite not possessing some of the dour and more cynical overtones that the subsequent two post-apocalyptic movies did, this movie still tells a really compelling story about an unlikely friendship that ends up having ripple effects on the entire world. It really is weird the more I think about it how many virus-related world-ending movies happened pretty much a decade before the pandemic. It's often been said that prequel movies don't work because of their inevitable build-up towards events, stories, and movies that we've seen already, but A, I don't really buy that, and B, this is the perfect example of how to do that right. For this filmmaking team to have the foresight to take one of the most iconic sci-fi movies ever made and actually take a quote-unquote realistic look at it by mixing essentially a virus movie with a faux National Geographic take that had a huge influence on future movies to come. Andy Serkis solidified his role here as the motion capture king, as his performance as Caesar served as a fantastic continuation of the depth and chameleonic nature he brought to the Gollum and King Kong characters previously. But the levels of humanity he's able to evoke from this non-human character is so heavy that it's scary. The film does an excellent job of being a low-key pandemic origin movie, and while James Franco's casting consistently gets worse and worse with the passing of time, this movie continues to get better with its unconventional take on a pre-apocalyptic story. The cool thing that most of the science fiction films do now that relates them to sci-fi films of yesteryear is that while the older films were allegories for at-the-time woes, the modern-day films seek to address the source of said woes with their stories. It's not necessarily something that works all the time, but when done right, it makes for some really cool and interesting new stories, and this film went on to spawn one of the best of the 2010s. Moneyball, the anti-baseball movie that ends up being one of the best baseball movies. I'll admit it's an area I'm weak in, considering that I'm not too big of a sports guy, but even I have to admit a gem when I see one. Based on the 2003 novel by Big Short writer Michael Lewis, the film centers around the Oakland A's 2001 to 2002 season, in which they had one of the biggest win streaks in baseball history, and the tactics taken by general manager Billy Beane that led to said victory. This film went through 3 different filmmakers before it finally landed at the feet of Capote director Bennett Miller, with Brad Pitt coming on as a producer to single-handedly save the project, with Steve Zalian's original script being rewritten by Aaron Sorkin, and the final result being something unlike any sports movie ever made before that. The film is actually a really interesting representation of the tactics used by Beane and Peter Brand, played in the movie by Jonah Hill, to achieve the victory that they did, swapping out tried and true baseball tactics for stats-only plays in order to build a winning team out of seemingly nothing, as the film is so focused on Billy's head that seemingly little actually happens. But the strong dialogue, adherence to building tension with character choices, and a superb lead performance carrying it through allows for this to be an engaging and rather informative watch as well. The 2012 Oscars for the 2011 film season are some of the worst in recent memory, with Brad Pitt and this movie losing out Best Picture and Best Actor to John Dujardin and The Artist, choices that continually get worse and worse with each passing year. It's a film all about breaking conventions, which always bodes well for a film's legacy. Rango. A last-minute addition, but a worthwhile one. I'll be the first person to admit that of all the traditional genres that I enjoy getting parodied and deconstructed, the one that I'm the most indifferent towards, let's call it, is Western, but only because they were essentially the superhero movies before superheroes, and that they were the most popular form of entertainment that Hollywood put out for so many years, to the point that they completely oversaturated the market. While they've largely disappeared from mainstream entertainment, there are still the occasional one-offs that pop up every now and then that remind you what this genre was like at its height. This is one of them, and the insane part is that this is yet another talking animal movie that was so popular at that period during the late 2000s and early 2010s. But the reason why I think this stands out is because rather than going the DreamWorks route where it's obvious that it's a parody and therefore leaning into the jokes by making a bunch of pop culture references and clever adages, it goes so far above and beyond by actually having a really compelling story. I don't know if the credit goes to John Logan for writing the actual script or Gore Verbinski for his take on it, but whatever the reasoning is, this movie rules. The story of a pet gecko who becomes separated from his humans, gets stranded in the desert, and comes across a dying old west town run by a variety of talking animals, who then uses his acting ability to mimic a cowboy, earn the town's respect, and eventually become the sheriff. The movie truly is one that can be watched by anyone. It's just colorful and poppy enough for kids, clever enough for movie bros, nuts enough for art types, and with enough jokes and not even really innuendos for adults. It's the ultimate combination of genres in an animated form that so many movies were striving for in the early 2010s before the Disney takeover. And in a lot of senses, this movie is where they peak. It just annoys me that still, after all this time, after everything that animated movies have done aesthetic-wise, they are still only regarded as primarily children's fare, because this is a shining example that it can be so much more. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I still don't know why this movie wasn't a bigger deal than it should have been. I'm still of the opinion that if this movie had made the money it should have, then we would have lived through a completely different 2010s. Well, this and a couple of other movies. David Fincher in the last decade, in addition to essentially changing the game by making House of Cards for Netflix, was all about adapting some of the darkest and most disturbing novels for the big screen post-Social Network. While I definitely think his work with Gone Girl was stronger, one cannot deny the absolute awe he inspires with his take on Stieg Larsson's first novel of his Millennium series. The plot sees journalist Michael Blomkvist, portrayed by Daniel Craig, teaming up with social outcast hacker Lisbeth Salander, portrayed by Rooney Mara, to solve the disappearance of a reclusive billionaire's granddaughter, and along the way they discover some heinous things about the man's family and their connections to the Nazi Party. This movie has everything a David Fincher fan could love. Conspiracy, mysterious isolated locations, crisp cinematography and pinpoint precise editing, a femme fatale, a mystery that goes back several decades, and some of the most gruesome and disturbing scenes ever put to film. We're so used to the idea of Daniel Craig killing in his James Bond that it comes as a shock when he's playing a more bookish personality who slowly realizes that he is in way over his head. And the story does this really interesting thing with how it portrays Salander by making her go through one of the most horrific experiences a person could go through as a means of giving her a personal reason as to why she wants to get involved in the case. That is novelistic storytelling done right that so many Hollywood producers are afraid of, and it annoys me when I see the past decade dominated by young adult dystopic novels adapted progressively worse and worse when we could have had more movies like this. It's a pitch black, bleak examination of the human soul wrapped up in a super awesome, engaging mystery, which is really just what we want from all of our movies, right? Young adult. It's a shame that Reitman the Younger never had the chance to really develop the rep that his dad did, because there's a strong argument to be made that he is the better director. Don't get me wrong, Ivan Reitman directed some absolute classics that will go down in history as staples of cinema and helped give rise to several comedy icons, but Jason Reitman's run in the late 2000s and early 2010s showed audiences a couple of things. A serious understanding of what made his father's movies enjoyable and watchable to so many, combined with a Gen X feel and a focus towards the inner tragedy of some of those happy-go-lucky characters. It's all summed up incredibly well with Young Adult, the story of an alcoholic ghostwriter who goes back to her hometown to supposedly get back together with her high school sweetheart. Reitman, in his second collaboration with writer Diablo Cody, capitalizes on the loneliness and need for socialization in adulthood, something that is very rarely looked at in glamorous Hollywood pictures. It shows the effects that failing to mature and move on from trauma can have on someone's psyche, and it still baffles me how Charlize Theron failed to get an Oscar nomination because she crushes it, playing this hideously unlikable character who you can tell is just bursting at the seams with inner tragedy. It sums up and utilizes Hitchcock's bomb metaphor perfectly, and besides the fact that people confronting their past in movies never ends well, the twist in this movie as to what happened to her is so brilliantly thought of that it's impossible to see coming. It's something that Diablo Cody would try again 7 years later with Tully, with the results there being a lot more mixed, but the seeds can definitely be found here. 2011 was a year with a lot of independent films focusing on the inner psyche, and this was one of the best. Warrior, the story of two estranged brothers who get involved in a mixed martial arts tournament and end up dealing with their animosity towards each other in the ring, doesn't sound like a story that's very original, especially given that boxing movies have not had a whole lot of moments to shine recently. However, in the hands of modern-day sports auteur Gavin O'Connor, and at the time up-and-coming stars Tom Hardy and Joel Edgerton playing the two brothers, this film ends up giving all the emotions, twists, turns, confrontations, and awesome moments we've come to expect from great sports movies. The movie also does this cool thing where it doesn't tell you that the two of them are brothers right away, which allows your anticipation of the final fight to grow with the rest of the movie. Structure-wise as well, it doesn't play out in the traditional sense, with Tom Hardy acting as this looming, intimidating specter before we're introduced to Joel Edgerton's more traditional, grounded struggle of getting back into the ring for monetary reasons to help his family. It's not until the halfway point when we learn the connection between the two of them. It's all tied up in the typical daddy issue subplot with Nick Nolte turning in a performance that earned him an Oscar nomination, and rightfully so. This is the type of movie that breaks conventions, which is what 2011 movies did the best, but more than that, it's a movie that was actually able to change up the structure of boxing movies, which is what earns it a spot this high on the list. Before we get to the number one choice, here are some honorable mentions. Drive. Every once in a while, you get one of those movies that you can't really explain in a way that sounds palatable to a mainstream audience, but just works on a visceral level. While Nicholas Winding Refn has certainly proven to be a bit of a problematic director in recent years, anyone remember Too Old to Die Young? It goes without question that Drive is one of the best auteurist pieces to come out of the past decade. A decade almost completely dominated by big-budget, special effects, spectacle-driven superhero fare. This truly is one of the last films that feels like the singular vision of one filmmaker, that also serves as an ode to cinema of old, contains some of the best performances ever, and has a really unique take on its story given the location. It's been said that Los Angeles has a really isolating, dehumanizing feeling, and there are a few movies done in recent years that embody that, but I really feel that this is the first one to have done that very well. Refn's characterization of Ryan Gosling's driver as a man constantly torn between wanting to have a normal life and being pulled back into the life of violence that he's just too good at and too familiar with is portrayed brilliantly, and the film serves as both another excellent installment in the crime genre, as well as a statement piece about what goes into maintaining a double life, one that's felt by all the characters in the film. The cast in and of itself is spectacular as well, sporting the likes of Bryan Cranston, Carey Mulligan, Oscar Isaac, Ron Perlman, and Albert Brooks giving one of the most villainous performances of the 21st century. Seriously, that scene where he stabs the guy in the pizza shop is going to make me think twice the next time I watch Finding Nemo. In a decade where art largely left the movies, it was nice to still have one that embodied all the elements that cinema bros like myself still love, which is why this movie is officially the best movie turning 10 in 2021. Seriously, if you guys haven't watched it and are fans of the Stranger Things and neon-drenched postmodern look of the Netflix era, do yourself a favor and watch this movie. It's fantastic. And that was it. Those are my top 10 favorite movies turning 10 in 2021, or movies from 2011. How many of you guys actually remember 2011? What were some of your favorite movies? What were some of your first movie experiences that you remember from that year? Whatever they are, leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to also give this video a like and click the subscribe button and the bell next to it. That way you guys can get notified every single time we put up new content. We put up new content 4 days a week. We've got more and more coming at you guys to occupy the rest of this summer into the fall, because 2021 is just ramping up. Thank you guys so much for continuing to come back and tune into our channel. You can also follow us on our social media profiles on Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast. Thank you guys so much once again, and as always, remember, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. See you guys next time.